Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today's episode has been a long time coming. Way back in episode 37, we talked about early Bruce Johnston work in an episode titled Bruce Before Terry. In episode 49, we talked about Bruce, Terry, and the Rip Chords. And in episode 55, we talked about Bruce's contribution to special projects in the early and mid-60s in an episode titled Bruce Goes Dragstrip. Well, today we're finally going to talk about Bruce and Terry. Bruce and Terry's discography boils down to basically 8 singles that were released on Columbia Records between 1964 and 1966. 2 of those singles were credited to the Rogues rather than Bruce and Terry. The rest have the moniker Bruce and Terry. There was additionally a single in 1975 credited to Terry Melcher and Bruce Johnston called Take It to Mexico. But that's sort of part of a different project. It's not exactly Bruce and Terry. When we get to the California Music Project, we'll talk about the single Take It to Mexico. So today we're just going to talk about the Bruce and Terry singles of the early to mid-60s. The first one up is a cover of the Beach Boys' Custom Machine, the first Bruce and Terry single, which was released January 1964. The Beach Boys version of Custom Machine, of course, had been the closing track on the Little Deuce Coupe album, released October 1963, about 4 months before the Bruce and Terry version was released. Both versions clock in at 1 minute 40 seconds long, though it feels to me like the Bruce and Terry version is taken at a slightly faster pace. It also seems to feature a more pounding piano, different from the more honky-tonk style of the Beach Boys. And I have to say, another distinguishing characteristic is the way they sing machine in the chorus is, to my ears, a little too shrill. Bruce and Terry's version of Custom Machine, like so many other car songs from the era, ends with a cacophony of drag racing effects that come in, kind of drown out the music, and then fade out. The B-side is an instrumental track, sort of a mid-pace surf instrumental, credited to Bruce Johnston, called Makaha at Midnight. And it's the same track that appeared on Bruce's August 1963 solo album, Surfin' Around the World, as Moksha After Midnight. Now, Makaha is a beach in Oahu, Hawaii. Moksha, the only one I could find, is a landlocked town in Nigeria, so probably not a surfing hotspot. I think they're correcting the spelling on the single to Makaha, but otherwise it's the same recording. The Custom Machine single was a bit of an inauspicious debut for Bruce and Terry, but it did reach number 85 on the US chart, so it didn't do too badly. The next single did even better. It reached number 72 nationally, but that sort of belies the popularity of it on the West Coast. Apparently it was extremely popular in the West, and for some reason just failed to catch on in the East. The single is probably their best known number, Summer Means Fun, with the B-side Yeah, which was released in June 1964, just in time for summer vacations. The A-side is a Sloan Berry composition, right in the Beach Boy, Jan and Dean summer fun tradition. It's a very nice production, one of the better productions of the early Bruce and Terry years, and certainly the best track of these early Bruce and Terry singles. The B-side, Yeah, is a piano-driven tune, very much a B-side, credited to Melcher and Johnston. It does have a vocal, which is just the word yeah, sung in a high-pitched falsetto with a little 1920-style warble to the vocal. The falsetto vocal on this strangely reminds me of the falsetto vocal featured in 1970 on the Pipkins novelty hit, Gimme Dat Dang. The next single came in December 1964 and is the first of 2 credited to the Rogues rather than Bruce and Terry. And I'm not sure, as far as I can tell, there's no real difference in the personnel between a Rogues single and a Bruce and Terry single. It seems to just be Bruce and Terry by another name. I'm hoping somebody can let me know if there's a difference or why they would have chosen to bill themselves on these 2 singles as the Rogues. Maybe somebody like Goran from the great Hot Rod and Surf Scene YouTube channel can chime in, or anybody else that has any information on that. In any case, the song is credited to the Rogues rather than Bruce and Terry. It's Every Day with Rogers Reef on the B-side. The A-side, of course, is the Buddy Holly classic, which was the B-side of Peggy Sue in 1957. They've taken the gentle Celeste-based original with Jerry Allison drumming on his knees and turned it into kind of a Dave Clark 5 type number, really souped it up, and there's a big honking saxophone solo in the middle, real different take on Every Day. The B-side, Rogers Reef, again, is definitely a B-side, but it kind of fools you. It's piano based, but it starts with what sounds like this classical romantic period piano. For a second you think it's going to be like a Rachmaninoff number or something, and then there's this sort of a cry or a groan, and then it breaks into this sort of crazy organ-based instrumental party B-side. This one too is credited to Melcher and Johnston. The next Bruce and Terry single, Carmen, with I Love You Model T on the B-side, came in March 1965, and it's clearly a much more ambitious undertaking. On the A-side, Carmen, you get trumpet, Spanish guitar, and castanets to give the track kind of a Spanish feeling, and you get a much more restrained vocal and a much more nuanced vocal arrangement than you'd had on any Bruce and Terry singles to this point. The B-side, I Love You Model T, is another Melcher-Johnston composition, but unlike previous Bruce and Terry B-sides, this is a complete song with lyrics and a polished production. Very extensive use of percussion, including kettle drum. The melody is not at all what you'd expect from a car song. It sounds more like a typical mid-60s love song. This is also one of the very few Bruce and Terry singles where you can really single out Bruce's vocal performance. Often it's really Terry that I hear on Bruce and Terry singles, but you can really hear Bruce here. Though in the middle section of the song, it really sounds more than anything like the Everly Brothers, very close to sounding like the Everly Brothers. There's a very sincere rap that Bruce does partway through, talking about how he wanted to have a Model T that he purchased himself as his very first car, and it strongly brings to mind the rap that the Everly Brothers had included in Ebony Eyes, their tear-jerking number 8 hit from 1961, which had been included as the B-side of Walk Right Back. I ran across one promotional ad for Bruce and Terry's Carmen single. It really seems that Bruce and Terry had high hopes for this particular release. The second and final Rogues single was released 1 month later in April of 1965, and it's sort of back to Party Records. And I'm wondering if maybe the Rogues name was so Bruce and Terry could sort of do Party Records and not have those confused with the increasingly ambitious Bruce and Terry singles. That's just a guess. It's a cover of Ritchie Valens' classic Come On Let's Go, with Rogers Reef Part 2 on the B-side. And though it's a party record, it's still a relatively more complex production with seemingly more carefully arranged instrumentals and voices than the earlier Bruce and Terry recordings. Also, unlike their earlier covers, rather than just pick up the tempo and play it harder, they seem to really be bringing out the melody of Come On Let's Go. Rogers Reef is credited to Melcher only. It's obviously a B-side, it's sort of a slow surf instrumental, but both sides of the record seem to have more complex and sophisticated productions than the records they had been doing a year previously. Now, whether this was because Bruce and Terry were becoming better producers and arrangers and performers, or whether it was just more was expected out of singles in 1965 because music was changing, I'm not sure. It was probably a combination of the two, I would guess. The next Bruce and Terry single, Raining in My Heart, with 4 strong winds on the B-side, didn't come along until about 5 months later in September 1965. The A-side is a Bryant and Bryant composition, first recorded by Buddy Holly and released as the B-side of It Doesn't Matter Anymore in 1959. Of course, for the Bruce and Terry version, they've dispensed with the heavy string arrangement of the Buddy Holly version, which would have sounded very dated by 1965. It's a very nice production, although at certain points there's a skating rink style organ break that comes in that for me really detracts from my overall enjoyment. And once again, you can't really hear Bruce on this recording. I really prefer the B-side, 4 Strong Winds, which was a song written by Ian Tyson of the Canadian folk duo Ian and Sylvia, and the title track to their 1963 album. It's been covered by a lot of artists over the years, maybe most notably in 1978 by fellow Canadian Neil Young on his album Comes a Time. It was also released as a single from this album, which only went to number 61 in the US, but it did receive extensive airplay, and that's certainly where I first heard 4 Strong Winds. It's a nice production, big production with strings and an orchestra. The vocals, again, don't sound much like either Bruce or Terry. They sound very, very much like the Byrds. In fact, I'd almost swear that you can hear David Crosby and Gene Clark in there somewhere, although from what I can see, the Byrds actually do not appear anywhere on it. Of course, Terry Melcher by this time was having great success as the producer for the Byrds, so the resemblance is probably not coincidental. It's actually one of my favorite Bruce and Terry tracks, But again, it really doesn't sound much like Bruce and Terry or Bruce Johnston, but it sounds like a very nice Byrds track. The penultimate Bruce and Terry single, Come Love, with Thank You Baby on the B-side, was released in January 1966. The A-side, Come Love, is another big production featuring a big brass arrangement and a very complex vocal arrangement, and also a very complex vocal arrangement in the counter melody in the chorus. It's got almost a military march feel to it, but with lyrics referencing rainbows, moonbeams, daffodils, and meadowlarks. It's a real slice of early psychedelia. Bruce and Terry had clearly come a long way from pounding out cover versions of Custom Machine. The B-side, Thank You Baby, is credited to Bruce Johnston and Dinny Dudley, and it's an equally big production featuring orchestra, strings, harpsichord, harp, and again, early psychedelic lyrics. The song is more of a ballad, but also features some complex tempo changes. Thank You Baby has also been the subject of several cover versions. Bruce himself co-produced one for Graham Bonney in 1967. It's also been covered by Rod McEwen, Claudine Longet, and notably by the Captain and Tennille on their 1976 Top 10 album, Song of Joy. What turned out to be the final Bruce and Terry single came out just 3 months later in April of 1966. The A-side was Girl, It's All Right Now, a Man Weil composition, sometimes just referred to as It's All Right Now. This is one where you can really hear Bruce's voice as well as Terry in the mix, and Bruce even has a little rap in the middle of the song. It's a ballady, mid-60s type love song. The B-side, Don't Run Away, is interesting in that the writing credit on the label is to Bruce Johnston, but the sheet music is credited to Bruce Johnston and Mike Love. Apparently Mike Love did write the lyrics for Don't Run Away. And I certainly have no idea why Mike would not have been credited on the record label as well as on the sheet music. Bruce, of course, had already been working with the Beach Boys for about a year at this point. It's a nice California ballad in the Beach Boys style with Bruce's voice front and center. It's the most Beach Boy-esque of the Bruce and Terry tracks, and for that reason it's probably my favorite. There doesn't seem to have been any real plan to make this the final Bruce and Terry single. I assume they just got busy with other projects, Bruce with the Beach Boys and Terry with production duties at Columbia Records. Their singles have become hard to find and very expensive. Fortunately, there have been some CD compilations released over the years. In 1992, there was a release called Bruce and Terry Rare Masters, which featured all the Bruce and Terry singles in chronological order, including Makaha at Midnight, followed by the 2 Rogues singles. It also included the Bruce co-produced version of Thank You Baby by Graham Bonney, and it also included an obscure recording by Joel Christie of Girl, It's All Right Now from 1965, which predates the Bruce and Terry version of this Man Weil composition. I can't see that there's any real Bruce and Terry connection to the Joel Christie recording. Let me know if I'm wrong about that. As far as I can tell, it's just an earlier version of the Man Weil song that Bruce and Terry covered about a year later. I have the compilation that came out in 1998 on Sundays called The Best of Bruce and Terry. It includes all the Bruce and Terry and Rogues releases. I really don't know why they didn't just call it The Complete Bruce and Terry, plus 5 previously unreleased recordings, some of them unfinished. The Sunday's release does not include Makaha at Midnight, which is maybe why they didn't call it complete, but if you have the Bruce Johnston Surfing Around the World, you already have Makaha at Midnight, so it's not really necessary. As far as the unreleased tracks go, the most interesting is a cover version of Help Me Rhonda, recorded by Bruce and Terry on March 28, 1965, shortly after the release of the Beach Boys' Today album. Apparently Bruce and Terry were looking for this as a potential A-side for themselves, but Brian Wilson asked them not to release it because he was planning to record it as a single, which of course he did to great effect and scored a #1. Bruce and Terry's version is very different in the choruses. They sing the Help Me Rhonda bit very, very differently. I won't say it's better, but it's certainly different and certainly very interesting. The Sunday's release includes some really nice liner notes. My one complaint is that the tracks are presented in an almost random order so that you don't really get the progression of the tracks the way you do if you listen to them chronologically. I wish they had presented them in chronological order rather than this sort of random arrangement. Nevertheless, it's great to have the work of 2 such important West Coast artists collected together in one place in good sound quality, especially when they were recording at such an interesting time and such a time of extreme change in popular music. Hope you've enjoyed this. Please let me know if I left out any Bruce and Terry stuff, or if you can answer some of the questions that I have. I'd really love to learn more about this. I know there are some Bruce sessions from the 60s that we haven't talked about. I think otherwise we've covered Bruce pretty well in the 60s. We still need to talk about the California Music Project, as I mentioned, Bruce's solo album, some of his production work in the 70s we might talk about at some point. Who knows, we might back up and go into his session work at some point. There's some pretty interesting things there as well. Hope you've enjoyed this. Please like, please comment, please subscribe if you haven't. Would really appreciate that. We'll see you next time. Looking forward to that. Bye.